Hi, I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And today I'm joined by Professor Michael Meyer, the Adolph S. Oakes Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, one of my teachers, someone who, when I was in graduate school, really compelled me to think about American Judaism beyond its American borders, to understand that religion and the people who observe religion are placed within a particular situation in time and in space. And for Professor Meyer, someone who's written both about the German experience, particularly Reform Judaism in its German environment, and also has traced how religion has been shaped and reshaped in Europe and the United States, has been a model even before we started speaking about transatlantic religion. Professor Meyer was already teaching us how to do that. And our business today is the engagement of Reform Judaism and Zionism, an interaction which has been far from static in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Well, thank you very much, Zev, for inviting me to be part of this series. It's an honor and a pleasure to do that. I think to understand the relationship between the Reform movement and Zionism, it's necessary to trace it back to the beginnings of Jewish modernity. Reform Judaism, and not Reform Judaism alone, but modern Judaism in general, was a response to modernity. Modernity on various levels, modernity of a social sort, of an economic sort, but also of an intellectual and religious sort. Jews were now living in Germany in an environment that no longer excluded them to the same extent as had been true in the Middle Ages. Jews began to identify with the values of their environment. They began to wonder whether a religion that was focused across the seas in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, was a Judaism appropriate and viable in the modern age. We can see this most clearly by looking at the concept of the Messiah, one of the principal concepts in Judaism, and one which relates the Jewish future to return to the ancient homeland. But now Jews were living in a society in which they identified with the country in which they were currently living. Therefore, they took the concept of the Messiah, the Reform movement did, and turned it into a messianic age which was universal in character. That means that there was no longer the desire to return, but rather desire to improve through Judaism the society in which they lived. And with this came the concept of the mission of Israel, something that was stressed by the Reform movement, but stressed by conservative leaders like Zacharias Frankel and Orthodox leaders like Shimshon Raphael Hirsch as well. Why should we continue to be Jews if we don't have a mission to the nations? And for the Reform Jews, that meant certain changes in the prayer book. It meant that they now regarded the notion of return to Zion and the prayer for that as being somehow hypocritical if it was not something that they really wanted to do. And therefore they made changes, but did allow for the fact that perhaps one day the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence of God, would return to Zion. But to a great extent, their future now was seen within Germany. Even their Zion as a messianic symbol was. It is interesting that the modern Orthodox rabbi, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, on one occasion said that wherever Torah emanates, there is my Zion. This certainly was the feeling among the reformers. And so in the course of the 19th century, Reform prayer books eliminated to a greater or lesser extent the return to Zion, and the vast majority of Reform Jews, when it came time for a political Zionist movement, rejected it. A meeting of rabbis, Orthodox, conservative, and liberal, rejected the notion of a Zionist Congress in Germany, with the result that it had to be moved from Munich to the Swiss city of Basel. Anti-Zionism continued very strong within the Reform movement in Germany until the Nazi period, when increasingly, out of the necessity of the dreadful anti-Semitism of Nazi times, they turned to Zionism, which is not to say there weren't Reform rabbis already in the 1920s who were Zionists, the most outstanding example being Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who was a very strong Zionist and who later became a civil rights leader in the United States, even giving a short talk before Martin Luther King at the famous march in Washington. The German Jews in the United States, to turn now to the United States, constituted the majority or the dominant group, let us say, within American Jewry until the great immigration of the East Europeans in the 1880s and thereafter. The German Reform Jews had even more reason to be opposed to Zionism because, for one thing, American Jewry was less anti-Semitic than was the case in Germany, and therefore they could dream of it as a golden Medina, as indeed the East European Jews dubbed it. But also, having migrated already once from Germany to the United States, the thought of a new uprooting and a going to Palestine was not something that they could easily think of positively. Now, that is not to say that there weren't some Zionists among the Reform Jews very early, but they had something to overcome, because in those days, and I'm thinking around 1900 or so, they faced a Zionist movement as represented by Theodor Herzl, who had said in his famous tract, The State of the Jews, often mistranslated as the Jewish state, he had said that in America, he only had a half a sentence devoted to America, and there he said that in America, our presence is also not desired. That's an almost exact quotation. Now, it was very hard then for Reform Jews and many other Jews as well to say that the American dream was really a nightmare, but we simply didn't see it that way. It was at this time that there was a sharp division between Zionists and anti-Zionists, to the extent, and this is something that I discovered in an article that I wrote, there was actually the notion that if you were a Reform Jew and you became a Zionist, or vice versa, that was a conversion, as if you had left one faith, a religious one, for a secular one, or vice versa. But as I said, there were also Reform Jews who were Zionists in the United States, even in this early period, and not Zionists alone. Interestingly enough, I found in my own research two brothers who were graduates of the Hebrew Union College around 1900, Max and Jacob Raisin. Max and Jacob Reisen were, in a sense, classical Reform Jews. That is to say, they were not individuals who paid a lot of attention to the importance of ceremonies in Judaism, of mitzvot ma'asiyot. But at the same time, they were not only active Zionists, but they were Hebraists. And one of them, Max Reisen, actually published in the Journal of Ahad Ha'am, the great proponent of cultural Zionism, Hashiloach, Hebrew articles reporting on life among Jews in the United States. And also interestingly, those early Zionists were not necessarily on the periphery of American Reform Judaism. The best example of that is Rabbi Max Heller of New Orleans, who not only was active in the Zionist movement, but also was the president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis about that time, meaning that he held the highest rabbinical position in American Reform Judaism at the time. And there were in this early period also individuals who would play a large role, not alone in the Reform movement, but in the Zionist movement in the United States and even worldwide. And two names come immediately to mind. One is, of course, Stephen Wise, who was a Zionist in this early period and later on would play a very large role because of his relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But also only a little bit later, Abba Hillel Silver, who would play an important role vis-a-vis the Republican Party, specifically through the senator from Ohio. Cleveland was the place where Abba Hillel Silver's synagogue was, namely Senator Taft, Robert Taft. Now, it is also interesting that the early Reform Zionists tended to go in the direction of cultural Zionism, which is to say the Zionism of Ahad Ha'am, which did not place so much emphasis on political action as it did upon a revival of the Hebraic spirit. So there were such cultural Zionists, for example, on the faculty of Hebrew Union College. One of them was David Neumark, a philosopher who was in close relationship with Ahad Ha'am. Another was the Hebraist and historian Gotthard Deutsch, taught Jewish history at the Hebrew Union College. And yet it must be said that these individuals were in the minority. The majority, as represented, for example, by the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, rejected Zionism because they, first of all, felt America was a place of safety and of a Jewish future, but also they rejected it because they felt that Zionism defined the Jews as a people, and as the Pittsburgh Platform indicates, they wanted to define to mark the Jewish identity as that of a, quote, religious community. Knesset Yisrael was a term they sometimes used in Hebrew rather than Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. So one has then in the teens and the 20s is a official anti-Zionism representing the majority and an unofficial, an official anti-Zionism and an unofficial Zionism. Now, how does the unofficial become the official? How does the minority become the majority? And this is what happens in the 1930s. It is often mistakenly stated that the Reform movement became Zionist only in 1948. That's not correct. It was a slow process. It was a process where Zionist thinkers began to say, it's possible to be both a Zionist and the Jew. One can be a Zionist Reform Jew. They were no longer opposites because there was the possibility of Jewish life both in the land of Israel and in the United States. Moreover, after Justice Brandeis became a Zionist, there could be no question any longer that Zionism was in any sense un-American. Well, to come now then to the 1930s, the first clear indication of a shift occurs at the convention of the Central Conference of American Rabbis in 1932, when it is decided to include Hatikva, the Zionist national anthem, in the Reform hymnal, along with the Star-Spangled Banner under national hymns. This is something that would have been hard to imagine even a decade earlier. That's step number one. What happens after that is in 1937. Now, one has to understand that at this point, anti-Semitism has becoming more and more extreme in Germany. And there's no question that that is playing a role here. The second role is played by the fact that there are more and more East European Jews with a sense of Jewish peoplehood, or of Yiddishkeit, to use the Yiddish word, are entering the Reform movement, entering Reform synagogues. So in response to this, in 1937, at a biennial conference of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, a resolution is passed calling upon uniting in the leading to the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So here are the laity calling for working toward a Jewish homeland, the very language of the Zionist movement. And that same year, and perhaps more famously, the rabbis get together in Columbus, Ohio, 50 years, a little more than 50 years after the Pittsburgh platform to establish the Columbus platform. The Columbus platform is very specific in favoring both political Zionism and cultural Zionism. Its language is the following. It calls for the, quote, upbuilding of a Jewish homeland, not only as a haven of refuge for the oppressed, but also a center of Jewish culture and spiritual life, end quote. The anti-Zionists have now become a minority. And in 1942, this minority establishes its own organization called the American Council for Judaism. It still exists, sort of, today, but at that time, it tried to exert its authority politically in various ways, which we don't have time to go into here. But the majority, and the majority keeps growing all the time, moves ever more towards Zionist engagement, and I would say reaches its high point in the 1970s. At that decade, a number of things happen. First of all, rabbinical students at the Reform Seminary, beginning in 1970, are now required to spend the first year of their studies in Israel, since it is inconceivable that a Reform rabbi in the United States doesn't have an intimate acquaintance with Eretz Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael, the land of Israel and the people of Israel. In 1977, the Reform movement establishes its own Zionist organization called the Association of Reform Zionists of America, or for short, ARTZA. And the Reform movement begins to play a role in the Zionist congresses from the 70s on. At about the same time, the international organization of the Reform movement, the World Union for Progressive Judaism, decides to move its headquarters from New York to Jerusalem. And about this time also, in the late 70s, early 80s, the Reform movement not only is establishing congregations in the state of Israel, but establishes 2 kibbutzim in the Arava, in the south, named Yahel and Lotan. And in 1987, finally, the Reform movement establishes IRAC, that is the Israel Religious Action Center, so that the Reform movement wants to play a role in bringing social justice within the state of Israel, even as it is devoted to social justice in the diaspora and in particular in the United States. The Reform movement has continued to grow since then. There are about 50 congregations presently in the state of Israel that are associated with the Israel movement for progressive Judaism. But I must conclude on a sober note, and that is this. I think that the 1970s were indeed the high point, and that since then, American Jews don't have quite the same attachment to Israel as they did in the wake of the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War of 1967 and 1973. There is an estrangement going on, and American Judaism, with values to the left of those of the Israeli government, perhaps best indicated today by the fact that, according to one figure, 77% of American Jewry, which is after all in which, after all, the Reform movement is the largest of the religious movements, 77% of American Jewry favored the Democratic Party in the last political election, whereas most Israelis, again 77%, feel strongly about the recent president of the United States. So there is a gap that is troublesome to many Reform Zionists today, a gap that many Reform Jews hope will be closed in the years ahead.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.